Welcome to another broadcast of Crime Beat with Ron Chepesiuk, the show that puts you, the listener, into the back alleys and boardrooms of the world's most fascinating subject, crime. Crime Beat brings you a lineup of dynamic and provocative guests who allow you to experience their lives and learn more about crime. Al Prophet, the noted crime documentarian, says, quote, Crime Beat is the best show of its kind for the thinking listener, both entertaining and educational. Let me introduce the host of Crime Beat. A native of Thunder Bay, Canada, Ron Chepesiuk is an award-winning author, documentary producer and director, publisher and screenwriter. He's the author of more than 36 books and 4,000 published magazine, newspaper, and internet articles. Ron is a two-time Fulbright Scholar to Bangladesh and Indonesia, was a consultant to the History Channel's Gangland TV series, and has worked as an instructor in UCLA's Extension Journalism program. 4 of Ron's books and several of his screenplays have been optioned for movies. For more information, visit ronchepesiuk.com. Given his publications, extensive travels, and in-depth interviews, Ron Chepesiuk today is the leading expert on the fascinating world of crime. Here he is, your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott, for that nice introduction. Good evening, world, wherever you are tonight. Well. It's been a hell of a month since our last live broadcast. Raging virus, riots, boycotting Trump, impeachment. Scott, we're still alive. That's one thing.
Well, so far we are. That's something to be happy for.
That's it. You get 150 suspects from that crazy riot that hit the Capitol on that, and internal inquiries into about 10 to 15 officers. You got Trump paying a price. You got companies and institutions are shunning him, including Deutsche Bank, his primary lender, which he used through the Russian Mafia, of course. And my guy, Bill Belichick, coach of New England Patriots, said he would not accept the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump this week. It's just been raining on Donald Trump, hasn't it, Scott?
Well, when you're a sociopath, life's difficult sometimes.
Yeah. But I'll tell you something. You had a good point there about him going to Scotland, that YouTube video you're telling me about.
Oh, yeah, the listeners, if you haven't seen it, there's a YouTube video of, I think it's the top dog in Scotland. It's a woman, and she says there have been preparations for the last several weeks for a White House aircraft to land at a nearby airport close to Donald Trump's golf course, and all the advanced teams are there doing all the security, and she does not know who's coming, but she says, we do not want you. So I believe maybe Trump's going to leave the country on the 19th.
He's going into exile on that.
Maybe.
But anyways, we have a great show tonight. Just coincidentally, we're going to be talking about the mob. We have Jeffrey Sussman back again. We had that great discussion about his book about boxing and the mob. He's got a new book out. It's called Big Apple Gangsters: The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. Mr. Sussman's book reveals how influential the mob in New York City was during the 20th century. We're going to look at the origins of organized crime in the 20th century, and we're going to examine the corporate activity that dominated New York City and how these entrepreneurial bosses supported successful criminal enterprises in other cities. We'll also look at some of the colorful gangsters who followed the footsteps of gangland's original founders. We will be with Jeffrey Sussman shortly. But first, our acknowledgments to the people who are helping make Crime Beat one of the most popular shows on the internet. First, I'd like to thank all our listeners out there from around the world for tuning into Crime Beat. We're thrilled and delighted to announce we had overwhelming positive comments and thumbs up about our program. Some of our shows are averaging now between 150,000 and 200,000 listeners every week from more than 160 countries around the globe. All shows are free and downloadable. You miss a live show, you go to the artistfirst.com website to listen to it. You can take our show and post them on any website. I'd like to thank our sponsors, GG Media Books, for supporting our show, and thanks to the production people at Artists First Radio Network, and a special thanks to the Ryan Brothers for allowing us to use their great music for our theme song. It's got the beat to crime written all over it. Now look at the mailbag for this week. We continue to get mail from all over the world. Some comments are long, so we edited them for length. We had a lot of mail about our show last week with James Patterson, the blockbuster writer. He makes like $89 million a year from his books. He wrote the book, The Last Days of John Lennon, and we discussed this. This one is from Beth. Beth writes, email. I'm a regular listener of Crime Beat, and it is a pleasant surprise to see the appearance of James Patterson, one of my favorite authors. The book on John Lennon sounds fascinating. I'm ordered my copy. You and about another million others. As soon as the book was released, it hit the New York Times bestsellers list. Must be nice, Scott, to be a writer like that.
I
encourage you to continue emailing us with your comments and suggestions. You can do that at crimebeat123@yahoo.com. That's crimebeat123@yahoo.com. Tell us if you want to use your name, no problem. So what have we been up to? Just go to tgmutabooks.com website. We have several books coming out. Some of them you might find interesting. We have affordable advertising opportunities for sponsors and authors. We have several packages to meet your budget. Contact us at crimebeat123@yahoo.com. Let's look at next week's show. The hits keep coming. On January 21, 2021, we have Anthony Amori back, and he's come out with another book about art heist called The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. So that should be really interesting. So let's look at the news for this week. We call this the Rap Sheet part of our program. Rap Sheet features a couple items of news that caught our attention you might have missed. This first item here, we've seen a lot of corruption in the U.S. political system recently. How does it compare to some other places? Well, there is Honduras, and the United States has given hundreds of $millions in security assistance to Honduras in recent years to help the Central American country fight drug traffickers. Well, last week, federal prosecutors in New York laid out fresh evidence suggesting that the nation's president himself helped traffic drugs. They say President Juan Orlando Hernandez used his nation's armed forces to protect huge shipments of cocaine in exchange for hefty bribes. The shocking allegations, the latest of three major drug cases which the president has been implicated, appeared in a motion filed recently in the U.S. Southern District Court in the case against an alleged Honduran trafficker arrested in Miami in March. Prosecutors said cite Hernandez as a co-conspirator in the case, saying he accepted money in exchange for protecting a cocaine laboratory and drug lords headed north towards the U.S. They quote Hernandez as saying he wanted to make the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, that's the DEA, think that Honduras was fighting drug trafficking, but instead he was going to, quote, shove the drugs right up the noses of the gringos by flooding the United States with cocaine. And of course, President Trump has praised Hernandez, who has visited the Oval Office multiple times, perhaps because he's a willing partner in controversial Trump administration's immigration measures. Under one agreement, Honduras has received non-Honduran migrants who have been denied a chance at claiming asylum in the U.S. Well, that's really amazing, Scott. We can have a drug trafficker right at the highest seat of government.
The United States House of Representatives passed a law legalizing marijuana in all 50 states recently. It has to go to the Senate. And the state of Oregon recently passed a law legalizing personal amounts of all drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, etc. That's how you're going to win the war.
The war on drugs. Right. And this is why the wall is crazy. They would have built a wall on our southern border to stop drugs if it would have worked. They would have built it 35 years ago. In any case, we have a second rap sheet item here. In the days following the violent insurrection on the U.S. Capitol building by Trump supporters, several Democrats at the House of Representatives demanded answers about how rioters were able to enter the Capitol and access certain rooms so easily. A Politico reported that some Democrats felt that Trump supporters were assisted by members of the Capitol Police as well as Capitol employees. Representative Stephen Horsford from Nevada reportedly said it was, quote, an inside job during a caucus call. During the call, many of the Democrats made mention of the ways that the Capitol Police aided in the siege of the building. Not only was there an inadequate number of officers at the scene, but after footage surfaced of the officers opening barricades, fencing to purposely allow the Trump supporters to descend on the Capitol, concerns were heightened. During a pre-recorded interview for Gray TV's Full Court Press with Greta Van Susteren, Representative Pramila Jayapal from Washington stated that she thinks Capitol Police may have possibly led the rioters to certain areas after breaching the Capitol. Wow, they suspended 2 officers, Scott, and they are investigating. It could have been a massacre if they got into that area where legislators were hiding. And it's really nice that one of them is going to receive a congressional medal for his heroism in leading those rioters away from the legislators.
Well, it's come out that Representative Mo, I can't remember his last name. He's the only rep with the first name Mo. It's reported
Brooks?
Mo Brooks was giving reconnaissance walkthroughs a couple days before. So there's inside, and they walked these people through, and they showed them where to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, some of those legislators, especially the Democrats, are really ticked off. So they're going to go after these people because they came very close to losing their lives. That's it for the rap sheet part of our program. We'll be back with Jeffrey Sussman after the station identification break. Scott?
You are listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. Find them at artistfirst.com. Back to your host, Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott. Well, listeners, Crime Beat featured guest this evening is Jeffrey Sussman, and we'll be discussing his latest book, Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. Mr. Sussman is the author of 15 nonfiction books. His other books include Boxing in the Mob, Notorious History of the Sweet Science, which we discussed on Crime Beat previously last year, or I think 1919, and Rakim Graziano, Fist, Fame, and Fortune, Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. In his day job, Jeffrey runs a very successful marketing and public relations company in New York City. With no further ado, welcome to the show, Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Right. I'm trying to think back to, and of course, it's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm trying to think back to when you were on the show. It seems like last century. It seems like a century
Well, it was
ago.
pre-COVID,
I mean,
that's for sure.
Yeah, pre-COVID. Everything pre-COVID seems like a couple of centuries ago on that.
I know.
On that. But how you been doing with the virus?
Well, as best as we can. Unfortunately, as it is where you are, I'm sure it is the same here, that nobody can get vaccinated. There's not enough of a vaccine around for people to get
Exactly.
it. And I spoke to a legislator today, and I was told that it would probably be months before New Yorkers can get it, and I'm sure it applies to the rest of the country.
Right. Well, is it tough getting your book out and publicizing it during a pandemic?
Well, what I've been doing is as with you, I've been doing telephone interviews and Zoom talks. I haven't done anything in person.
Wow, that's really amazing. So how's the book doing? You seem to be getting a lot of publicity. I was on the internet yesterday, and there was a lot of stuff on this book, and it's very interesting stuff too.
Well, I've done a number of libraries and private clubs, all on Zoom, and then there were some newspaper articles that were very nice to me, and I even got into the New Yorker magazine, which did a feature story on the mob, and they included my book in the story.
Oh,
so
wow.
I was pleased about that. And it seems to be going pretty well. I'm pleased with it.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be a built-in fascination in the public about the mob, right?
Absolutely.
How do you explain this fascination? It seems like, there's hundreds of books coming out every year on the mob, and people can't seem to get enough of them.
That's absolutely true. I think, well, for one thing, we've romanticized these people. We've taken away, we've kind of glossed over the psychopathology of a lot of these people who were, just serial killers, many of them.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons that people find them fascinating is that they don't have to abide by any rules. They seem to be able to do whatever they want, however they want, and they make millions and millions of dollars. And some of them, of course, get caught and spend a long time in prison. But a lot of others, seem to lead very gifted lives where nothing bad happens to them. And I think that, for people who live their lives by the rules and obey the laws, and they feel constricted by this, they can vicariously live more adventurous lives by reading about the mob.
Jeffrey, what makes your book different? It's another mob book, and there's several come out every year, and you're dealing with familiar territory. So how is your book going to be different?
Well, it covers the entire chronology of the 20th century and even goes into the 21st century, whereas, other books focus on just a few mobsters or a specific period of time. So if you get a book like, let's say, Goodfellas, which was actually based on a book called Wise Guy. It just deals with a certain group of people, and it's just confined to that. And the same thing goes for Casino, and the great mob book, The Godfather, is all fiction, and nothing in that book actually ever happened, whereas everything in my book happened. It's all true, and I deal with the chronology by profiling 19 different, very, very colorful mobsters who controlled the mob. That's the other thing. A lot of gangster books and gangster movies, they deal with low-level mobsters, as in Goodfellas. Mine deals with very high-level people who had enormous control, and they were the ones who gave the orders.
That's interesting. So what do you hope readers get out of buying your book?
Well, I think they'll get a terrific overview of how the mob exerted control over so many different industries, whether it was trucking, whether it was the restaurant business, whether it was the private carding business, whether it was boxing, gambling, prostitution, drugs. I mean, they had an element of control in all of this, and it was fascinating the way that they did it. There were some who just specialized in union corruption. There were some who just specialized in the garment industry. There were others who just specialized in gambling. They were like an octopus, and like a large corporation with many subsidiary companies.
Right. Well, you did some original research. You did some interviews. Who was the most interesting person you talked to?
One of the most interesting people I spoke to was a man named Jimmy Napoli, whose father controlled all the bookies on the East Coast of the United States. And his father got him a job as a manager at the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. And he told me an interesting story about that Frank Sinatra used to he used to entertain there, but he also used to gamble a lot. And one night he wanted a $50,000 line of credit. And the overall manager of the Sands Hotel Casino, a man named Carl Cohn, wouldn't give it to him. And Sinatra had a fit and was yelling and cursing and throwing things around and demanded to see Carl Cohn. And Carl Cohn met him in the coffee shop of the Sands late one night or early in the morning. It must have been like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And Sinatra was screaming and yelling at him. And then he called Carl Cohn a dirty Jew, and Carl Cohn grabbed him by his shirt collars and beat him up and knocked out his 4 front teeth. And Jimmy Napoli had to drive Sinatra to an oral dental surgeon to have his lips sewn up because he was bleeding so profusely. And then coming back to the hotel, Sinatra called Jimmy Knapp's Tony Knapp's father. It was Tony Knapp, who his father was Jimmy Knapp, called Jimmy Napoli and said he wanted Carl Cohn killed. And Jimmy Knapp said to him, "You can't have him killed, Frank. He's one of us, and he's protected. And also, look at who's signing your checks. It's Carl Cohn. You work for him. He doesn't work for you, and he's a protected guy. You can't touch him." Well, Frank Sinatra was so upset that he drove his golf cart through the plate glass window of the Sands and then flew back to Los Angeles to get his teeth recapped. And when people in Las Vegas heard about this, apparently a lot of people didn't like Sinatra. Signs went up all over Las Vegas saying, "Elect Carl Cohn mayor."
Wow, that's really a great story. How did you hook up with this Napoli guy?
A friend of mine who is a New York City organized crime detective suggested that I interview him, and he gave me the name of another detective who was a friend of Tony Napoli, and I called and I left this other detective's name, and he called me back. And then we had a a terrific conversation. He was a very nice guy, and his information was fascinating. And another person who I interviewed, the one who suggested I call him, was a New York City organized crime detective. I think you may know him, Anthony Solano. I think you interviewed him.
Yeah, Solano, Anthony.
Right, and he had been part of the organized crime strike force for the Queens District Attorney's Office, and it was his job to surveil John Gotti during one of the trials because they were worried that John Gotti might try to skip the country. And so he and his partner were sitting in front of John Gotti's house watching it in an unmarked police car. And someone notified John Gotti that these two guys were out there. And John Gotti came running out of the house in a tracksuit. Anthony said that he was unshaven, his hair was uncombed. It wasn't the image that you normally saw of him, very nicely dressed and manicured and every hair in place. And he started yelling and cursing at these two guys. And Anthony's partner pulled out a 9mm pistol, which he was holding in his lap. And Anthony was worried that he would pull the pistol out and shoot John Gotti, so he kept his hand on top of his partner's hand, which was on top of the gun. And the whole time, John Gotti is screaming and yelling, and they're not saying a word. They're just listening to him mouth off. And at the end, Anthony just said to him, "Look, John, we're just doing our job. We're just doing what the DA wants us to do." And then John Gotti said, "Yeah, well, I know that guy, and I know who he's fooling around with, and I'm going to get him, and you can tell him that he can meet me in the local schoolyard, and he can bring a Glock 9, and I'll still meet him." And so Anthony went back and told the DA about what happened, and the DA said, "Okay, we're going to go out to John Gotti's social club." And they both got in the car, and they drove to Gotti's social club. Gotti wasn't there, but all of his crew were, and they just walked around looking at things, and none of the crew members would say anything, but they all looked as if they were all set to jump on Anthony and his boss, who was a district attorney. And incidentally, 20 years ago, I had interviewed his boss, the district attorney, a man named Remy Franciscini, who wrote a book about John Gotti, and he gave me some fascinating information from 20 years ago that I was able to use in the book. So I have a lot of interviews with people who report information that's never been reported before.
Yeah, it was really interesting because people close to the mob don't like to talk,
Yeah, and, I interviewed a couple of people who, they let me interview them, but I wasn't allowed to quote them or mention their names. I could say pretty much what they said in my words, but I couldn't quote them directly.
Exactly. Well, let's get into the story. How did the mob in America get started?
Well, it was interesting. It was started by a man who was kind of a genius in a way. His name was Arnold Rothstein. He had fixed the 1919 World Series, and there had been a lot of gangs in New York, but there were ethnic gangs. There were Italian gangs, there were Jewish gangs, there were Irish gangs, there were German gangs, and they were always fighting with each other. He had this idea of organizing all the gangs into a unit, like a corporation, and he picked 4 protégés who he thought had the ability to organize this, and they were Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, and they were all young men. And he taught them how to organize crime. He also taught them manners. He taught them how to dress, how to look businesslike, and how to conduct themselves. And there at the time there had been 2 mafia families in New York. One was run by a man named Joe the Boss Mazzaria, and the other was run by a man named Salvatore Maranzano. And these 2 men would only deal with Sicilians. They wouldn't deal with anyone else, no matter how profitable it was. And Rothstein's 4 protégés said, this is crazy. We're not interested in someone's religion or ethnicity. or background. We're only interested in making money. And these two guys are stifling us. So they eliminated them. They actually arranged for them to be assassinated.
Right.
And Lucky Luciano was involved in the assassination of Joe the Boss Masseria. And then Lucky Luciano had a peculiar sense of humor. Salvatore Maranzano was known for being very anti-Semitic. So Lucky Luciano hired 5 Jewish gangsters to kill him.
Yeah, well,
he thought there was poetic justice in that.
It's kind of ironic. It's interesting about Arnold, Rothstein, because he's associated with the 1990 World Series, right? That's what made him famous.
Exactly.
The fixing of that World Series. But people don't really realize how important he was to the history of the Mafia in this country.
Exactly, and that was the most noteworthy thing he did. But he also controlled drugs. He financed all the big Prohibition operations on the East Coast in the 1920s. He financed the importation of drugs into the United States. That's another myth about the mob, that they don't deal in drugs. They most certainly do deal in drugs, but they do it at the highest levels in terms of financing it. They don't want the lower level people dealing with drugs because they're worried that the government could flip them.
Right.
And then they would wind up testifying against the bosses. That's the only reason that the low-level people are not permitted to deal in drugs.
Well, it's interesting about Rothstein. He made a tragic end, which seems to be the case in almost all of the big characters, right? Eventually, they lived a high life. They're famous and all that, and in the end, they get arrested and they get put away.
Well, that's true. I mean, even Lucky Luciano has served about 10 or 11 years in prison before he was deported. But Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello died of old age and served a minimal amount of time in prison. They were two of the smartest of the gangsters. And then there was only one mob boss who was ever sentenced to death, and that was a man named Louis Lepke Buchholter, who ran all the illegal unions in the United States, and with Albert Anastasia ran Murder Incorporated. Right. And he was executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing in 1944.
Right. Well, you mentioned Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. That was a strange relationship, right? I mean, they became best of friends, but they seemed to work together so well.
They met when they were teenagers. Lucky Luciano's gang on the Lower East Side had tried to shake down Meyer Lansky, and Meyer Lansky told them to get lost, and supposedly Lucky Luciano was impressed by Lansky's moxie, and they became friends, and they were such close friends that they were able to finish each other's sentences, and Lansky was the one who schemed to get Lucky Luciano out of prison, and they were as close as brothers. It was extraordinary.
Right. Well, we're going to stop there, and we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about Prohibition, how it impacted on Mafia development.
Okay.
Scott?
Hey everybody, Z-Man here to tell you about a new book that's the first of its kind in any language. It's called The Sicilian Mafia, a true crime travel guide by author Carl Russo. Carl Russo spent 8 years photographing mafia hotspots in Sicily. The book is packed with photos of the actual locations where the Godfathers lived, where murders happened, and where the victims are buried. From the fishing villages on the Mediterranean to the alleys of Palermo, this part of Italy provides the backdrop for over 100 meticulously researched tales of murder and mayhem. The Sicilian Mafia, a true crime travel guide by Carl Russo, will take you closer to the Sicilian Mafia than you dare think possible. Pick up your copy at strategicmediabooks.com. That's strategicmediabooks.com. You're You're listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. Back to your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott. We're here with Jeffrey Sussman, and we are discussing his latest book, Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. And the book is available pretty well everywhere, right, Jeffrey?
Yeah, because of the COVID, the best places probably to get it are either Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
And there's an ebook and audiobook?
The audiobook isn't out yet, but yes, there's an ebook. I believe there's an ebook. I'm not sure. I think there's an ebook, and the hardback.
Right. And you're active on social media, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Is there a website for the book?
Not for the book. I have, a website for my PR marketing business called powerpublicity.com. But
powerpublicity.com.
Yeah, but there's a lot of if anyone goes to YouTube and put my name in, they'll find a lot of information about me in the book.
Right, on that end. And do you tweet?
Periodically, yes, I do.
Right, okay, on that. So getting back to our discussion, and we're dealing with the sweeping history of the Mafia in America, and Prohibition is very interesting. Could the mob have grown the way it did without Prohibition?
No, it made Lansky, Costello, Luciano, and Siegel, and a few others, Joe Adonis, multimillionaires, and they were able to then utilize that money into other operations. So, for example, Meyer Lansky siphoned a lot of that money into gambling casinos, and he had ownership positions in probably a dozen Las Vegas casinos at one time.
Right. On that, why was New York City the base of their operation?
Well, because they all came from initially from poor immigrant families, and the immigrants when they arrived in America around 1900 or between, let's say, 1890 and 1910, their point of departure was Ellis Island, and then because they were poor, they all moved into tenements on the Lower East Side. And the East Side, Lower East Side at that time, was divided into not only ethnic neighborhoods, let's say of Jews and Italians and Germans and Irish, but even amongst the Italians, there was one neighborhood for the Neapolitans, there was one neighborhood for the Calabrians, there was another neighborhood for the Sicilians. The demarcations were just extraordinary. And eventually these people came to know one another and to overcome the rivalries that they had with one another.
Right. But the mob eventually spread out across the country. There are big operations in Cleveland, Chicago, New Orleans, and all that. Was it planned, or was it spontaneous?
It was really opportunistic. Al Capone originally started in Brooklyn and went out to Chicago because there were opportunities. After Prohibition ended, Mayor LaGuardia in New York got rid of a lot of gambling, so Frank Costello moved his gambling and slot machine operations to New Orleans, and he bribed Governor Huey Long, gave him $1 million to let him operate without any problems. And then Meyer Lansky moved his operations to Hollywood, Florida, and Miami, Florida, and from there he moved them to Havana, Cuba. And then Bugsy Siegel was sent out to Hollywood, where initially he was involved in establishing a racing wire called the Transamerica Wire, and then also getting involved with the unions that controlled stage hands and set decorators and so forth, and extorting from the movie studios large sums of money so that they wouldn't have to endure strikes during the production of movies. Right.
But they got the Mafia. One of the things that it led to was massive corruption, right?
Absolutely.
The political system.
Frank Costello, whose real name, by the way, was Francisca Castiglia. He took an Irish-sounding name because at the time he was dealing with Irish bootleggers, and he thought it would be easier for him to get along with them if he had an Irish name. But he was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He didn't even believe in carrying a gun. he felt that he could achieve whatever he wanted by bribing a lot of political figures, and he did very successfully.
Right, but it almost got him killed.
It almost got him killed, and you know, he was a delegate to the 1932 Democratic Convention that elected Franklin Roosevelt.
Right, on that. Well, we're talking about Luciano and what a seminal figure he was in the history of the mob. What was the impact of the commission on Mafia history?
Well, you know,
that was formed in 1931 by Lucky Luciano after the war that it developed.
Right. Well, it was very interesting because Lansky and Luciano discussed how there should be a national crime syndicate, and sitting on the board of the crime syndicate could be the heads of the Mafia families, as well as other gangsters who weren't members of the Mafia, who let's say they were Jewish or Polish or whatever. But what a lot of people don't understand in popular culture is that the National Crime Syndicate had more power than the Mafia Commission, because they oversaw the whole country. Basically, the Mafia Commission just oversaw what went on in New York primarily.
Right.
But you know, people who sat on the Mafia Commission also sat on the National Crime Syndicate Commission. But there were many other members on that National Crime Syndicate. So, you know, even a boss like, at one point, Albert Anastasia wanted to have somebody killed. He went and asked Meyer Lansky for his permission to kill that person.
Right. Is the commission still powerful? Does it still operate today?
You know, I spoke to somebody who knows a lot about this, and he said since when Rudy Giuliani successfully prosecuted the bosses of the five families who all sat on the commission, the mob has been keeping a very, very low profile because under the Rico statute, those men all went away for about 100 years, and no one wants to go away for that long. There used to be a saying in the Mafia, you know, that if I get arrested, I'll do 5 to 10. I'll be sentenced to 5 to 10 years, and I'll do 3 to 7, and I can do that standing on my head. They used to say, but nobody wants to go away for 100 years. So they're very, very careful about what they're doing, and they don't want anybody to notice them.
Right. Well, we talked about some of the Mafia figures, Lansky and Luciano and Anastasia, but there were some heroes that took on the mob, right? We talk about Kennedy and Dewey, but one guy that sort of sticks out because not too many people know about him is Burton Turkish, right? What's his claim to fame?
He prosecuted the gangsters of Murder Incorporated, which was controlled by Lepke and Albert Anastasia, and it consisted of about 100 murderers, primarily Italians and Jews, and they were all on retainer, and they only did hits that they were ordered to do. None of them were freelancers, and they it was estimated that they killed several thousand people around the country. They would be sent on missions to kill people, and Burton Turkish was able to crack this and win an enormous number of convictions that wound up ending Murder Incorporated. Right. What a lot of people don't know is that before Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky teamed up or went under the tutelage of Arnold Rothstein, they ran a gang in New York called the Bug-Meyer Mob, and that evolved. That was the gang that evolved into Murder Incorporated.
Oh, wow. On that. But why didn't the mob just knock off some of these prosecutors? I always wondered about that.
Well, Dutch Schultz wanted to have Thomas Dewey killed, and so did Albert Anastasia, and so did Lepke Buchholter's partner, a man named Jacob Shapiro. But the rest of the syndicate said no, that it would bring too much heat on us, and we're not going to do it. And it was a terrible mistake because Dewey then went and prosecuted all of these people and wound up getting a 50-year jail sentence for Lucky Luciano, and he sent Lepke Buchholter to the electric chair, and these were people who didn't want him killed. So they may have regretted their decision.
Meanwhile, they whacked Dutch Schultz.
Well, it was very interesting. I became interested in mob history when I was a teenager because my father introduced me to an uncle of his when I was 13 years old. His name was Irving Kay, and he was a bootlegger, and he was kept a very, very low profile. He even hired a public relations man to make sure that his name never appeared in the newspaper. And I asked my father about him, and he said that Irving was indicted but never tried for the murder of Dutch Schultz because they were enemies during Prohibition, when both of them were trying to control bootlegging in Harlem and the Bronx.
Right. Well, what's interesting about your book, you mentioned Dutch Schultz, and you also, which I was kind of really surprised, Stephanie St. Clair was one of my real heroines. I did a book called Gangsters of Harlem, and I have a chapter on her in the book, and it was really interesting to see. She was really something, wasn't she, as a numbers runner, and standing up to the mafia. She was by herself.
She was a very tough woman, and she really stood up against Dutch Schultz, and he wasn't able to control her or get rid of her numbers operation.
Right, on that. Well, we're going to take another break, and then we'll be back for the last part of our program. Scott?
Hey everybody, Z-Man here to tell you about another great book from Strategic Media Books. Longtime CNN journalist John Didakis is back with his third mystery novel, a gripping thriller titled Troubled Water. The book features the young feisty reporter Lark Chadwick. Just as Lark is about to begin her new job on the cops and courts beat, she discovers the body of a strangled girl, the first victim of a serial killer. Lark has to deal with rivals in the newsroom, a superstar athlete with anger issues, a hunky colleague who becomes a suspect, and her job's in danger. With the help of her friend Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Lionel Stone, Lark is tested like never before in a dramatic life and death showdown with the killer. Troubled Water by author John Didakis shows what happens when you pair a cub reporter with murder, mayhem, and a handsome bad boy. You get a great book. Pick up your copy at strategicmediabooks.com. That's strategicmediabooks.com. You are listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. Send us your questions and comments to crimebeat123@yahoo.com. Back to your host, Ron Chepesiuk.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. We're here with Jeffrey Sussman, and we're discussing his really interesting book, Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. It's available everywhere. There's not an audio book out yet, but it should be out shortly. Jeffrey is active on Facebook, and you can check him out on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff on him on YouTube. Anything you wish to add, Jeffrey, about that?
No, I just hope that people, go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com and pick up a copy of Big Apple Gangsters. I think they'll find it very entertaining.
Right. Well, you're talking about some of the myths about the mafia. You're talking about drugs. One of the myths, I think, is that Jews were excluded from the mafia. That was a myth, right?
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Mainly because of the movies.
Yeah. I spoke to an old mafia guy in his 80s about the myths perpetrated by the Godfather, and he said he looked upon the movie as a great comedy because there were so many myths there, and I asked him specifically what he thought of, and he said, well, the character of Sollozzo, who wanted to go into the drug business and buy the politicians, he said he could have done that on his own. He didn't need the Godfather to do that, right. and yet they made a big deal out of it. And then he also mentioned the fact that the bosses deal in drugs, and yet the movie made a big deal out of showing that the bosses would not deal in drugs. And then he said also the killing of a policeman, he said the mob would never kill a policeman because if they did, it would bring down the entire police force. It would bring down all kinds of federal agencies on them, and they'd wind up shutting down all their businesses. And he gave me a perfect example. There was in the 1980s, there was a low-level mobster named Constable Faraci who murdered a DEA agent named Everett Hatcher, and the police department, the FBI, the DEA, they went after the mob in a big way. They closed down businesses after businesses that they operated here in New York, so much so that finally the Bonanno crime family sent someone out to kill this guy Faraci, who was in hiding. And once they killed him, they called the DEA to let them know that he had been killed. Right. And then everything returned to normal again.
Wow. And that, well, the movies have sort of distorted the reality of the mob, right?
Yeah. He told me one other thing that was very interesting. He said, when there's an attempted assassination of the Godfather, his bodyguard calls out sick. And he said a bodyguard never would have done that because that would immediately alert people that there was trouble coming. He said if a mob boss is going to be killed, the bodyguard will step back a few feet so as not to be shot, but he won't call out sick because that'll only wind up getting him killed.
Right. So TV and movies have really distorted the reality of the Mafia, right?
I think so. Certainly, the Godfather movie definitely has.
Right. Do you have a favorite movie that you think is pretty accurate?
I think they've taken liberties with a lot of the truth, but I think that Goodfellas and Casino are, by and large, accurate.
Right. Well, the Goodfellas movie is really interesting because I think the book is the best book ever written on organized crime.
Wise Guy. Wise Guy's a terrific book.
Yeah. Nicholas Pileggi. It's really, in fact, I'm doing a book now on a Colombian drug trafficker. I'm modeling it after Pileggi's book.
Oh, wonderful! I wish you all success with it.
Yeah, on that then. Well, you're talking about the Rico statute and going to jail for 100 years, rather than 7 or 8 on that then. Did the mob ever recover from implementation of the Rico statute?
Not really. I mean, it's out there. I spoke to a criminal defense lawyer who advises current members in the mob, and he said they're just operating in the shadows, and they're always checking to find out if what they're doing could bring down the Rico statutes on them because they're terrified of it.
Right. And one big question that fascinates me is, did the mob have anything to do with the killing of JFK? Well, that's one of the most controversial parts of their history.
Well, Robert Blakey, who wrote the Rico statute and was the lawyer and investigator for the Senate Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, said that yes, the mob arranged for the killing of JFK.
Is that right?
And he mentioned a number of things that Jack Ruby was the godfather of Jimmy Hoffa's son, and Hoffa was is on tape talking to Carlos Marcella, who was the mob boss of Louisiana, who Robert Kennedy had gone after in a big way and had him parachuted out of a plane into Guatemala, and Carlos Marcella made his way back. And when he returned to Louisiana, he was on the phone with Jimmy Hoffa, and Jimmy Hoffa said, "We're going to kill that son of a bitch, Robert Kennedy." Right. And Carlos Marcella says to him, "You don't kill a dog by chopping off its tail. You kill it by chopping off the head." Wow. And John F. Kennedy was the head. Robert Kennedy got more convictions against the mob than all the attorney generals of the United States put together. It was between 300 and 400 indictments that he came up with. It was extraordinary, and the mob hated him, and yet they knew if they just got rid of Robert Kennedy, he would be replaced. But once John Kennedy was gone, Robert Kennedy would be gone.
Right. Wow. What's interesting is we were talking about John Gotti. He had that really interesting anecdote about him. And I'm just wondering, do you think he's the biggest disaster to hit the mob?
Yeah. Well, that's what.
I mean, he killed Castellano, number one, which was a no-no, and got away with it. And then all of his flamboyance.
Well, the other mob bosses wanted to kill Gotti for doing that, and Vincent Gigante actually sent some people out to kill Gotti. They got the wrong people, but Sammy Gravano said that John Gotti was the worst thing that ever happened to the mob. That he was such a publicity hound that he just drew so much attention to himself and other mobsters, and it was terrible for business.
Right. You're talking about Gravano. You have an interesting anecdote about a mob attorney, right? About his encounters with Sammy Gravano.
Yeah, a criminal defense attorney named Joseph Giannini helped his father open a discotheque in Brooklyn, and it was very, very successful. It was taking in a lot of money. And after it had been opened for about 4 or 5 weeks, he said Gravano came in, and according to Giannini, he said, "We're taking it over, and you're out." And he had no choice but to get out. I mean, Gravano mentions it in his book with a slightly different take on it, but it's the same story. And Joe Giannini told me that he represented 2 people in the Lucchese crime family. And he went to one of them at that time, a man named Big Al Visconti, and Al said, I'll look into it for you, and then came back a few days later and said, there's nothing I can do. He's taken it over. The only thing I can do is I can recover your father's initial investment. He's willing to part with that, but that's it.
Wow, on that. Well, we only got a couple minutes, and so we're finishing up here, but looking at the mob today, how powerful is it, given everything that's happened to it with Rico and interfighting amongst itself? How would you assess the mob today as a force in organized crime?
It's still there. It's still operating, but they're getting competition from the Russians, the Albanians, and the Chinese.
Right, on that then. And what's up for you next?
I want to do another mob book. I haven't decided on exactly the topic, but I'm investigating a number of topics, and hopefully I'll come up with something in the next couple of weeks.
Well, this has been a really interesting discussion, and we hope you do that book, and we hope you come back on our show.
I'd love
Jeffrey.
to. I appreciate doing it very much.
Yeah, and we appreciate having you. Have a great evening this evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Well, that's our program for tonight. Just a reminder for all you listeners out there, our next program is scheduled for January 21, and we're 2021. We're going to bring you Anthony Amore, and he wrote a book called The Woman Who Stole Premiere. We hope you enjoyed Crime Beat this evening on the Artist First World Radio Network. Wherever you are tonight, we'd like to thank all of you out there for listening to our broadcast this evening. In the meantime, we welcome your emails and thoughts about our program. You can email us at crimebeat123@yahoo.com, and please spread the word about our show. And until next week, we hope you tune in to Crime Beat next Thursday, same time at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where you'll want to have a front row seat to the fascinating world of crime. Sleep tight, everybody.
Hey everybody, Z-Man here to tell you about a new book that's the first of its kind in any language. It's called The Sicilian Mafia, a true crime travel guide by author Carl Russo. Carl Russo spent 8 years photographing mafia hotspots in Sicily. The book is packed with photos of the actual locations where the Godfathers lived, where murders happened, and where the victims are buried. From the fishing villages on the Mediterranean to the alleys of Palermo, this part of Italy provides the backdrop for over 100 meticulously researched tales of murder and mayhem. The Sicilian Mafia, a true crime travel guide by Carl Russo, will take you closer to the Sicilian Mafia than you dare think possible. Pick up your copy at strategicmediabooks.com. That's strategicmediabooks.com.